global emissions will soon have to peak and then fall if we want to stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The UN Climate Panel, IPCC, has found that there's a fair chance to limit the increase to 2 degrees Celsius in the global temperature if global emissions peak soon and are then more than halved by 2050. The baseline shows the rise in emissions that will occur over time if nothing is done to stop it. To reach the 2 degrees Celsius goal, it's been proposed that developed countries reduce their emissions by 25 to 40% by 2020 compared to 1990 emission levels, while developing countries limit their emissions by 15 to 30% compared to the baseline. To limit emissions compared to the baseline means that emissions can still grow for a while, though not as fast as they would do if no additional measures were taken. The Climate Convention distinguishes between Annex I countries, also called developed countries, and non-Annex I countries, also called developing countries. All Annex I countries are willing to reduce their emissions. However, some find it unrealistic and not necessary to cut their emissions by 25 to 40% by 2020, while others think it's too risky to wait. The European Union says that the common target for all developed countries should be a 30% reduction. The United States, though, doesn't want to reduce by that much by 2020. They say that what counts is getting on a viable path between now and 2050. A somewhat steeper path in the latter period could make up for the slightly slower start. Most developed countries plan to make cuts in their emissions, but they also say that they'll only make big cuts if developing countries take on obligations too. Several non-Annex I countries are large emitters, and in the long run, global warming can't be contained if these countries don't limit their emissions. All non-Annex I countries say that developed countries must take the lead in emission reductions. They say that developed countries have the historical responsibility for global warming and the means to do something about it. Additionally, most non-Annex I countries are willing to limit their rise in emissions compared to the baseline, but not to make actual reductions by 2020. All countries agree that low-income countries need support in order to limit their emissions. Some non-Annex I countries have a substantial economic income and/or high emissions. So a major debate in the climate negotiations is whether these countries should take on bigger commitments in a new climate deal to limit emissions than other developing countries. Some argue that if they don't, it will be impossible to sufficiently limit global warming, even if targets are set high for Annex I countries. Others argue that it's unfair to treat these countries differently from developing countries in general. When discussing who should limit or reduce emissions and by how much, some prefer to consider the economic welfare of the country. Others prefer to consider the size of emissions. Others again say that both aspects should be taken into account. Emissions can be measured either per country or per person. Measured per country, several countries that are presently categorized as developing countries have very high emissions and therefore a significant impact on global warming. If measured per person, however, these countries have much lower emissions than developed countries. In China, emissions have been growing very rapidly. In fact, China is now responsible for producing more emissions than any other nation in the world. Although China's emissions will continue to rise, they plan to limit the rise by introducing new technology and by using energy more efficiently. Chinese companies producing batteries, electric vehicles, solar panels and wind turbines are growing rapidly. The Indian government says that priority goes to economic growth to end poverty, while shifting to cleaner sources led by solar energy. It's also said that India's emissions per person will never exceed those of rich nations. It's possible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by minimizing the use of fossil fuels and making a transition of the energy system to low-carbon technologies. But it's also costly. The larger the cuts in emissions, the bigger the transition. Developed countries have the means to make the transition to low-carbon economies, and developing countries have the opportunity to choose new development paths, although they may need support. Economists and others discuss whether or not the initial costs associated with the transition will be of economic benefit in the long run. According to some economists, one should take into account that the actions to limit global warming will become easier to make in the future as technologies become cheaper and people become richer as a result of economic growth. According to others, the costs of inaction far exceed the costs of reducing emissions. The costs of damages will grow as global warming accelerates. And the costs of reducing emissions will be covered as new technologies become competitive. Until recently, politicians and economists in many countries have said that cutting emissions would harm their economy. Today, many say that the shift to a low-carbon economy would benefit their country.